They mocked the veteran for talking to a rock, until his dog forced him inside, and what he found 50 feet in changed everything. The wind in the Idaho mountains never really stops. It just changes direction. Ethan Cole learned that the hard way, alone in a broken cabin after losing everything that once defined him. No family, no purpose, just silence, and a dog that refused to leave his side. But one morning, that dog stopped at a crack in the rock and wouldn't move. Not for food, not for nightfall. What it heard, Ethan couldn't. Not yet. Before we go further, drop a quick comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches. The wind came down from the ridgeline like it had teeth. It slipped through the pines, scraped along the granite, and found every loose board in the small cabin Ethan Cole called home. By the time it reached the clearing, it had lost none of its edge. It rattled the tin cup hanging by the door and pushed a thin line of dust across the wooden floor. Ethan didn't look up. He sat on the step outside, elbows on his knees, watching the tree line the way a man watches something that might move if he stops paying attention. 41 years old, and his posture still held the quiet tension of someone who had spent too long listening for things to go wrong, a habit that never quite left. The mountains of Idaho stretched out around him, cold, sharp, indifferent. Early winter had already settled in. Frost clung to the ground in the shadows, and the air carried that dry, metallic bite that came just before the first real snow. Behind him, the cabin leaned slightly into the slope, as if it had given up arguing with the wind years ago. In front of him, the land dropped off toward a narrow pass of granite and scrub. No road, no neighbors in sight, just rock, trees, and distance. That was the point. A low sound broke through the wind, not loud, not sudden, just wrong. Ethan's head turned slightly. Coda stood about 20 yards out, near the base of a granite wall that cut through the land like a scar. The dog's body was rigid, tail low but not tucked, ears forward. He wasn't barking, wasn't pacing. He was listening. Ethan didn't move right away. He watched. Coda shifted his weight once, then stepped closer to the rock. His head tilted slightly, then pressed forward, ear against stone. The dog went still, too still. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly against his knees. That wasn't curiosity. That wasn't distraction. That was focus. "Hey," Ethan called, voice low but firm. Coda didn't respond. The wind pushed through again, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. Nothing else. No movement. No sound Ethan could pick up. But Coda let out a low, almost inaudible growl. It wasn't a warning bark. It wasn't aggression. It was something else. Something under the surface. Ethan stood. Not fast, not slow, just controlled. His boots pressed into the frozen dirt as he moved forward, each step deliberate, his eyes scanning the area out of instinct. Tree line, ridge above, ground between, clear. His right hand dropped unconsciously to his side, fingers brushing against the handle of the knife clipped at his belt. He didn't draw it. Well, didn't need to. But he noted it. Always noted it. By the time he reached Coda, the dog hadn't moved. Up close, Ethan could see the tension in him. Muscles tight under the thick coat. Breath slow but measured. His nose flared once, then stilled again. Ethan followed the dog's line of sight. The granite wall looked like every other stretch of rock out here. Rough, cold, weathered by years of wind and ice. Nothing remarkable, nothing obvious. He stepped closer. Coda shifted slightly, but didn't pull away, keeping his ear pressed to the same narrow section of stone. Ethan crouched beside him. "What is it?" No answer, of course. Just the wind. Ethan leaned forward, placing his palm flat against the rock where Coda had been focused. Cold, solid, dead. He kept his hand there for a few seconds, then pressed harder, and as if pressure might reveal something hidden beneath the surface. Nothing. He pulled his hand back and leaned in closer, bringing his ear toward the stone. The granite smelled faintly of dust and old minerals, dry, lifeless. He listened. The wind moved around him, brushing past his jacket, slipping into the spaces between rock and earth. But beyond that, nothing. No water. No movement. No echo, just silence. Ethan pulled back slightly, eyes narrowing. He glanced at Coda. The dog hadn't changed position, still listening, still locked onto that exact spot. Another low growl vibrated in his chest. Ethan studied the rock again. There, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. A thin, vertical crack, no wider than a man's shoulders at its broadest point, narrower at the edges, and it ran up the face of the granite like a line drawn by something that didn't care if it was seen. Ethan reached out and traced it with his fingers. The edges were rough, natural, not cut. He pressed his hand near the opening again. Cold, same as before. He exhaled slowly. Nothing there, buddy. Coda didn't move, didn't even look at him. Another gust of wind swept down the ridge, stronger this time, pushing against Ethan's back. He turned his head instinctively, scanning the slope above. Clear. Always clear. When he looked back, Coda had shifted slightly, pressing his nose closer to the crack now, inhaling deeply, then pausing again, listening. Ethan stood up. All right. He stepped back, giving the dog space. Enough. Coda didn't respond. The dog stayed exactly where he was. Ethan watched him for a moment longer, then turned toward the cabin. The sky was already beginning to dim, the kind of fast-falling light that came with mountain evenings this time of year. Temperature would drop soon, hard. He took a few steps, then stopped. Something in the back of his mind didn't sit right. He turned again. Coda hadn't moved. Still at the rock. Still listening. Ethan stared at him for a few seconds, jaw tightening slightly. Your call, he muttered under his breath. He headed back toward the cabin, boots crunching softly against the frost. Behind him, the dog remained. The wind picked up again, threading through the trees, carrying that same dry, biting edge. It rattled the loose boards on the cabin, shifted the branches, whispered across the rock. But Coda didn't move. The last light drained from the sky, and the cold settled deeper into the ground. The dog stayed at the crack in the granite, ear pressed against the stone, listening to something no one else could hear. The cold came fast after dark. By the time Ethan pushed the cabin door shut behind him, the wind had sharpened into something steady and relentless. It pressed against the walls, found the seams, whispered through the cracks like it knew the place better than he did. He dropped the latch into place and stood there for a second, listening. Not to the wind, to what might be under it. Nothing. Just the same hollow quiet that had followed him for years. He moved across the small room without turning on the lantern. Didn't need it. He knew the layout by memory now, the table, the chair with the loose leg. The narrow cot pushed against the far wall. His hand brushed the edge of the table, then the back of the chair. Grounding points, confirming space. Clear. He reached for the lantern anyway, lit it, and set it down low. The flame flickered once, then steadied, casting long shadows that moved with every shift of the wind outside. Ethan sat, boots still on, jacket still zipped. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as if something might reveal itself there if he waited long enough. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time didn't move the same out here. A metallic rattle cut through the room. Sharp, sudden. Ethan was on his feet before the sound finished. The chair scraped back hard against the floor. His body had already turned toward the door, shoulders squared, breathing shallow, eyes locked on the entry. The sound came again. A loose hook. The tin cup outside, swinging in the wind. Ethan didn't move for a second longer. His pulse stayed high, steady, like it hadn't gotten the message yet. He exhaled once, slow. Then again. His hand, already at his side, loosened slightly from the knife grip. Not a threat. Not here. Not now. He stepped toward the door, lifted the latch, and cracked it open just enough to look through. Dark. Tree line still. Wind moving through branches. No silhouettes. No movement. He shut the door again, slower this time, and dropped the latch back into place. When he turned around, the cabin felt smaller. The lantern light seemed thinner. He sat back down. Didn't take off his boots. Didn't lie down. The wind shifted again, and for a moment, just a moment, it changed pitch. Low, rotating. There's a distant thump, thump, thump layered under the sound. Ethan's head lifted slightly, his eyes unfocused. Rotor wash, hot air, sand, noise pushing against the inside of his skull. His jaw tightened. The lantern light flickered, and suddenly it wasn't a cabin anymore. It was something else. Too bright, too loud, too close. "Hold perimeter," someone said. Or maybe it was memory filling the silence. Ethan blinked hard. The sound snapped back to wind. Just wind. He stood again, this time slower, controlled, and walked to the small window. He didn't pull the curtain aside all the way, just enough to see. The ridgeline cut against the sky, black against darker black. Nothing moved. His eyes tracked left to right, pausing at the tree line, then the open ground, then back again. Routine, always routine. But he stayed there longer than he needed to, then longer than that. Eventually, he stepped back and returned to the chair. He didn't lie down, didn't even try. Sleep wasn't something you chased. It was something that caught you off guard. And tonight wasn't going to be that night. Hours passed in fragments. The wind shifted. The temperature dropped. The lantern burned lower. Once something scraped against the side of the cabin. A branch, maybe. Ethan froze again. Listened. Counted the seconds between sounds. Nothing followed. Still he stood, crossed the room, and checked the back corner. Then the door. Then the window again. Perimeter. Clear. He sat again. The silence stretched, and in that silence something else started to press in. A weight. Not outside. Inside. Images without edges. On flashes that didn't belong to this place. A radio call cut too short. A shape moving where it shouldn't. The sound of something breaking. Ethan's hand tightened into a fist. He leaned forward, elbows pressing into his knees harder now. "Not here," he muttered under his breath. The words came out low, flat. He stayed like that for a long time, until something else pulled his attention. Not inside, outside. A faint shift in the rhythm of the night. Not the wind, not the trees. Different. Ethan stood again. This time, no hesitation. He crossed the room, lifted the latch, and stepped outside into the cold. The air hit him hard, sharp enough to clear the last of the haze from his head. He didn't move right away. Just listened. The wind pushed past him, cutting across the clearing. And then, there, a shape, cut near the granite wall. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Coda. Still there. Exactly where he had been before. The dog hadn't moved. Not an inch. Ethan stepped forward slowly, boots crunching against the frozen ground. Coda. The name carried just enough to reach him. No response. The dog remained fixed on the rock, ear pressed against the same narrow crack. Ethan stopped a few feet away. Something in the stillness felt wrong. Not dangerous. Just wrong. Like time had paused around that spot and forgotten to start again. "How long you been out here?" He didn't expect an answer. Coda shifted slightly. Not away. Closer. His nose pressed into the crack now, inhaling once, then holding still again. Ethan glanced at the rock. Same as before. Cold. Solid. Unremarkable. He stepped closer. The wind cut around them, louder now, but pushing through the pass like it was trying to move something that wouldn't give. Ethan reached out again, placing his hand near the crack. Cold. Same as before. He frowned slightly. then pulled his hand back. Coda let out another low growl. Not loud, not aggressive, but deeper this time. More certain. Ethan watched him. You hearing something? The dog didn't look at him, didn't break focus. Ethan exhaled slowly, breath turning white in the air. Yeah, he muttered. Didn't think so. He stood there for another moment, watching the dog, watching the rock, watching the dark space between them. Then he turned. Come on. He took a step back toward the cabin. Coda didn't follow. Ethan stopped, looked back. The dog hadn't moved, still at the crack, still listening. The wind howled through the ridge, louder now, and carrying the cold deeper into the clearing. Ethan stood there, caught between the cabin behind him and the silence in front of him. Then he shook his head once. Suit yourself. He walked back toward the cabin, slower this time, but when he reached the door, he didn't go inside right away. He turned again. Coda was still there, unmoving, locked onto something that Ethan still couldn't hear. And for the first time since he'd come out here, the quiet didn't feel empty anymore. Morning came without announcement. No sunrise spilling gold across the land, no soft shift in color. Just a slow lifting of darkness into gray. The kind of light that didn't warm anything. Ethan was already awake. He hadn't slept. Not really. At some point, he had sat down on the edge of the cot, then leaned forward, elbows on his knees. No, the lantern had burned out hours ago. The cabin had gone cold. He stayed there anyway, listening, not to the wind, to the absence of it. The moment when the world paused between night and day. His eyes tracked the door before he stood, boots still on. Same as before. He moved to the door, lifted the latch, and stepped outside into air that bit harder than the night before. Frost had settled across the ground in a thin, white layer. The trees stood still now. No wind, no movement. Too quiet. Ethan scanned the ridge out of habit. Left, right, tree line, ground. Nothing. Then his eyes moved forward. The granite wall. Coda. Still there. The dog hadn't left. Not all night. Ethan didn't react right away. He just stood there, taking that in. Then he stepped forward. Slow. Controlled. Oh, Coda. The name carried in the still air. This time the dog's ears twitched slightly. But he didn't turn. Didn't step away. Still locked on the same point in the rock. Ethan closed the distance. Up close he could see it clearer now. The crack. It wasn't just a surface split. It had depth. A narrow opening that cut into the granite at a slight angle, like something had forced its way through from the inside. Ethan crouched. Coda shifted just enough to give him space, but stayed close. Too close for comfort, if this had been anything else. Ethan leaned in, closer than before. He didn't touch it yet, just watched, waited, listened. Nothing. He exhaled slowly, then reached forward, placing his palm flat against the stone beside the crack. Cold. Same as last night. He slid his hand closer. Closer. Then he paused. But something changed. Not the stone. The air. It was subtle. Barely there. But different. Ethan moved his hand again, this time directly in front of the crack, and felt it. A faint current. Not wind. Not from outside. From within, his fingers stiffened slightly. He held them there. Waited. The sensation didn't disappear. It stayed. Weak, but steady. Ethan leaned in further, bringing his face closer to the opening. The smell hit him first. Not strong, but distinct, damp, mineral, like water running over rock somewhere out of sight. His jaw tightened slightly. He glanced at Coda. The dog's breathing had slowed, focused, his eyes fixed on the same narrow line in the stone. You smell that? Coda didn't move. Didn't need to. Ethan shifted again, angling his body to look deeper into the crack. No, there was no light inside, just darkness. But the air, it didn't match the outside temperature. He slid his hand into the opening, slowly, carefully. The granite scraped lightly against his knuckles as he pushed deeper. A few inches in, nothing. Then, the air changed again. Warmer. Not by much, but enough. Ethan stopped, held his hand there. The warmth didn't come and go. It stayed. Steady. He pulled his hand back slightly, then pushed it in again, testing. Same result. His eyes narrowed. That's not right. He sat back on his heels, thinking. The ground was frozen solid. Night temperatures had dropped below freezing for days now. Nothing out here should feel like that. Nothing. Coda shifted again, this time pressing his nose into the crack, inhaling deeply, then letting out a low sound, almost like a whine, but tighter, urgent. Ethan watched him, then looked back at the rock. He stood slowly, stepped back, and began to circle the area. Not randomly, deliberately. He checked the base of the wall, the ground around it, the slope above, looking for signs, tracks, disturbance, anything. Nothing obvious. The frost lay undisturbed except for Coda's paw prints. The rock face stretched on either side, solid and unchanged. Ethan returned to the crack, stared at it again. His mind ran through possibilities. Underground stream, cavity, geothermal pocket. None of them fit clean. Not here. Not like this. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folding knife, flipped it open, not as a weapon, as a tool. He crouched again and ran the tip of the blade along the edge of the crack, while the metal clicked lightly against stone. Natural formation. No clean lines. No signs of cutting. He pressed the blade into the opening slightly, then pulled it back out. Cold. The warmth wasn't coming from the rock. It was coming from inside. Ethan sat there for a long moment, thinking. Coda let out another low sound. More insistent now. Ethan looked at him, then back at the crack, then at the ridge above. He stood again, walked a few steps back, looked at the angle of the rock face, measured distance with his eyes, then looked down at the ground, then back to the crack. Calculating. Always calculating. His breathing slowed. His posture shifted. Not relaxed. Focused. Different. All right. The word came out quiet. More to himself than anything else. He stepped forward again, but placed his hand near the crack one last time, felt the faint current of warm air brushing against his skin, then pulled back. Tomorrow. He glanced at Coda. The dog finally looked at him, ears forward, waiting. Ethan nodded once. We check it. Coda held his gaze for a second longer, then looked back at the rock, as if he'd already known the answer. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, staring at the narrow opening. The darkness inside didn't shift, didn't reveal anything. But it didn't feel empty anymore, not like it had before. He turned and walked back toward the cabin. This time, Coda followed, but only after one last pause, one last press of his ear against the stone, as if committing something to memory, or listening just a little longer. Ethan didn't wait for full daylight. Gray was enough, but the sky had just started to separate from the mountains when he stepped out of the cabin again, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder and a lantern in his hand. The cold hit harder than the morning before, sharper, more awake. Coda was already ahead of him, back at the rock. Waiting. Not restless, not pacing, just there. Ethan walked up slower this time, not because he was unsure, but because his mind had already shifted gears. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was entry. He stopped a few feet from the crack, and set the lantern down on the ground. The flame inside flickered once as the wind brushed past, then steadied. Ethan crouched and checked the opening again. Same as yesterday. Narrow, angled, dark. He ran his hand along the edges, feeling for anything that might give. Loose rock, weak points. Nothing. Solid. And Coda stepped closer, pressing his nose into the crack, then pulling back slightly, as if urging him forward. Ethan glanced at him. "You're real sure about this?" The dog didn't blink, didn't hesitate. Ethan nodded once. "Yeah, thought so." He set the rope down and looped it loosely over a jagged outcrop beside the opening. Not an anchor. Not yet. Just a reference point. Then he picked up the lantern, held it close, and leaned in. The light pushed into the crack, cutting a thin path through the darkness. The space inside didn't open up. It narrowed. Ethan turned his shoulders slightly and stepped in. The stone closed around him almost immediately, cold against his jacket, rough against his back. The smell changed as he moved forward. Less dust, more damp. Coda slipped past him with ease, moving ahead into the dark without hesitation. Ethan watched the dog's silhouette for a second, then shifted his weight and followed. One step. Pause. Second step. Pause. His boots tested each patch of ground before committing weight. The floor wasn't flat. Slight incline. Uneven rock. He adjusted his stance. Lower center of gravity. Lantern forward. Breathing controlled. In. Out. The walls pressed closer for the first 10 feet. Maybe less, hard to tell. Time didn't measure the same in tight spaces. Ethan angled his body sideways, shoulder brushing one wall, back against the other. Shoulder slide. The words came back without him meaning to say them. Old training, old habits. He moved again, slow, deliberate. The lantern light barely reached more than a few feet ahead. Beyond that, just shadow. And Coda's shape flickered in and out of view. Then, gone. Ethan stopped, completely still. The absence hit first. No movement ahead. No sound. The dog had been there, and now he wasn't. Coda. The word came out low, controlled. It didn't echo. That was the first thing that felt wrong. In a space this tight, sound should bounce and should come back, but it didn't. It just stopped. Ethan's grip tightened slightly on the lantern. He tilted it forward. Nothing. Just the curve of rock bending slightly to the left. A turn. He listened. No movement. No breathing. No claws against stone. Nothing. Ethan took one step forward. Then another. Slower now. More careful. The air felt different here. Still. Heavy. Not moving the way it should in a confined space. He paused again at the bend, leaned slightly to the left, raised the lantern, and stepped through. The space changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but enough. The walls eased back, just a few inches at first, then more. Ethan straightened slightly, tested the space. Another step. More room. The pressure on his shoulders lifted. He exhaled, not realizing he'd been holding his breath. Coda? His voice carried a little further now. Still no echo, but something else. A faint sound. Not wind, not movement. Something softer. Ethan moved forward again, following the curve of the passage. The ground leveled out slightly. The air shifted, warmer. Not enough to be comfortable, but enough to notice. His breath no longer came out in sharp white clouds. He stopped, held still, listened. There. Again. A faint, almost rhythmic sound. He couldn't place it. Not yet. Coda appeared ahead. Just a shape at first, then clearer. Standing still. Waiting. Ethan's chest loosened slightly. You could have made a sound. Coda didn't move, just turned his head slightly, then looked forward again. Ethan followed his gaze. The passage ahead opened further, not wide, but wider. Enough that Ethan no longer had to turn sideways. He stepped forward, closing the distance. Each step felt quieter now. The rock absorbed sound instead of reflecting it. The lantern light reached further, and then the wall ahead disappeared. Ethan stopped, not because he chose to, because his body did, automatically. The space in front of him dropped away into something larger. The light pushed forward and didn't hit a wall. It stretched, faded, disappeared into open darkness. Ethan's breathing slowed. He took one careful step forward, then another. The ground dipped slightly, then leveled out. The air changed again. Warmer now. Not just faint. Noticeable. His eyes adjusted slowly, and then he saw it. Not clearly, not all at once, but enough. The space ahead wasn't a tunnel anymore. It was something else. Something bigger. Something that shouldn't have been there. Ethan didn't move for a few seconds, just stood at the edge of it. Lantern held out. Light trembling slightly in his hand. Coda stepped forward, into the darkness, and stopped. Right at the center of whatever lay beyond. He turned back, looked at Ethan, and waited. Ethan swallowed once, then stepped forward, out of the narrow passage and into the unknown. The first thing Ethan noticed wasn't what he saw, it was what he felt. Yet the air didn't bite. It didn't press cold into his lungs or sting the inside of his nose the way it had outside. It wrapped instead. Subtle. Steady. Not warm like a fire, but wrong enough to stop him mid-step. He didn't move for a moment. Just stood there. Lantern held out, letting his senses catch up. The light spread forward, slow and uneven, touching stone in layers. What had seemed like open darkness a second ago began to take shape. Walls, high, curved, not smooth, but worn by something that had been here longer than any storm outside. The ceiling rose above him in fractured angles, slabs of granite leaning against one another, leaving thin seams where pale daylight slipped through. Not enough to brighten the space, but enough to give it a strange, muted glow beneath the lantern light. Ethan took another step, then another, while his boots met stone, not dirt, solid, uneven in places, but not loose. The space widened around him, 20 feet, 30 maybe, hard to tell. Coda stood ahead near the center, his outline clearer now. Still, watching. Ethan lowered the lantern slightly. The beam shifted and caught movement. Not a creature. Water. A thin line of it, tracing along the far wall. It seeped from a narrow horizontal break in the rock, catching the light as it ran downward in a narrow ribbon. It didn't fall in drops. It flowed. Slow. Constant. Ethan's breathing changed. He moved toward it without thinking. The sound reached him now. Faint. A soft, steady trickle. That had been the rhythm he couldn't place. He crouched beside the wall, setting the lantern down on a flat stretch of stone. The light settled low, casting upward shadows that made the space feel deeper than it was. Ethan reached out, paused, then placed his fingers into the stream. He held them there, waiting for the shock of cold. It didn't come. The water was mild, not warm like a heated surface, but far from cold. His fingers stayed submerged longer than necessary, testing, confirming. He pulled them back slowly, watching the droplets fall from his skin. "That's not possible." The words came out quiet, flat, like a statement, not a reaction. Coda stepped closer, lowering his head to the water, drinking in slow, measured laps. Ethan watched him for a second, then leaned forward again, scooping a small amount into his palm. He hesitated, then tasted it. Mineral. Clean. Not stagnant. Not contaminated. His jaw shifted slightly as he processed it. Shut, he sat back on his heels, eyes moving now, taking in the rest. The basin stretched wider than he first thought. The far wall curved inward slightly, forming a natural boundary. Along one side, the rock had shaped itself into shallow ledges, flat enough to hold weight. Storage. Sleeping. His mind filled in the blanks without asking permission. The air held moisture, but not enough to choke. It moved differently here. Not wind, but not stagnant either. A slow exchange through the cracks above. Ethan looked up. The thin seams in the ceiling filtered pale light downward, dust and moisture catching it in faint, drifting patterns. It wasn't bright, but it was enough. Enough to see shapes. Enough to orient. Enough to live. His gaze dropped back to the ground. A shallow depression near the base of the seep had collected water into a small pool, no more than a couple of inches deep, but steady. Self-feeding, self-maintaining. Ethan exhaled slowly. His shoulders, which had been tight since he entered the passage, lowered just slightly. Coda moved away from the wall, circling once, then stopping again in the center. He looked back at Ethan. Not curious, not uncertain. Certain. As if this place had been waiting. Ethan pushed himself to his feet. Turned slowly, scanning the entire space. Edges. Angles. Blind spots. Old habits again. But they didn't find anything threatening. No signs of recent disturbance. No tracks. No remains. Just stone. Water. Light. And quiet. A different kind of quiet. Not empty, not hollow, full. He walked the perimeter, counting steps, went marking distances, touching surfaces. Everywhere he moved, the same thing followed him. Consistency. The temperature didn't shift. The air didn't thin. The sound of water never stopped. He returned to the center. Coda sat now, watching him. Ethan stood there for a long moment, lantern in hand, the weight of what he was looking at settling slowly into place. This wasn't just a cave. It wasn't just shelter. It was something else. Something built by time, not by people. Something hidden. Something that didn't belong to the world outside. He turned toward the passage behind him. The narrow opening looked smaller now, less important, like an afterthought. His eyes moved back to the basin, then to the water, then to Coda. The dog didn't move, didn't need to. Ethan took a step back, then another, then stopped, and his voice came out low, almost to himself. This place, he looked around again, measured it, felt it, could keep someone alive. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They stayed where they were spoken. Ethan stood there a few seconds longer, then crouched and picked up the lantern again. He didn't leave right away. He walked the space once more, slower this time, less like a search, more like a memory. Mapping it, committing it. Coda followed at his side. Close now, always within reach. When Ethan finally turned toward the passage, the light shifted again, casting long shadows behind him. He paused at the entrance, looked back. The basin didn't disappear into darkness. It held its shape, held its presence, as if it would still be there no matter how long he stayed away. Ethan stepped into the narrow passage. The air cooled immediately. The walls closed in again. But something had changed. The tightness didn't press the same way. Not anymore. Behind him, the hidden world remained. And ahead. The outside suddenly felt smaller than it had before. The cold hit him harder on the way out. Not because it had changed. Because he had. Ethan stepped out of the crack and into the open air, the wind catching his jacket immediately, pushing against him like it had something to prove. The sky had shifted to a pale, washed-out gray. Clouds moved low over the ridge, dragging the light down with them. Coda emerged behind him, shaking once, then turning back toward the crack. Ethan didn't move right away. He stood there, facing the rock, as if expecting it to close, to disappear, to prove that what he had just seen wasn't real. But the crack remained. Narrow, unremarkable, silent. He exhaled slowly, then turned and walked back toward the cabin. The ground felt different under his boots. Same frost, same uneven dirt. But his steps didn't land the same way. Coda followed close now, closer than before. No hesitation, no pauses. By the time they reached the cabin, the wind had picked up again, threading through the gaps in the wood, rattling the same loose pieces it always did. Ethan stepped inside and shut the door. The space felt tighter, colder, smaller. He didn't light the lantern. Didn't need to. The dim light from outside filtered through the window just enough. He sat down on the chair, hands resting loosely on his knees, and stayed there. Minutes passed. Maybe longer. Oh, he didn't track it. Didn't try. His mind moved through the space he had just left. The basin, the water, the light, the warmth. Each detail replayed. Not in fragments, but whole. Complete. He could still feel the temperature on his skin, still hear the steady trickle of water, still see the way the light filtered down through the fractured stone. It didn't fade. It stayed. Too clear. Too close. Ethan leaned forward slightly, elbows pressing into his thighs, his hands clasped loosely together. He stared at the floor. The cabin creaked once as the wind shifted. A soft, hollow sound. For a second, just a second, it lined up with something else. A different place. Different air. The creak turned into a metallic pop, then a sharp crack. Ethan's head snapped up. His body followed before thought could catch up. He was on his feet, turning toward the door, shoulders tight, breathing shallow. The room changed around him. Edges sharpened. Shadows deepened. Every angle mattered. Every corner held weight. He took 2 steps forward, stopped, listened. Nothing. Just the wind. The same wind. The same cabin. The same quiet. Ethan didn't move. His chest rose and fell once. Then again. Slower. He forced the air out. In. Out. The tension didn't leave all at once. It drained. Piece by piece. His shoulders dropped slightly. His hands unclenched. He turned away from the door and walked back to the chair. Sat down again. This time slower. More deliberate. Coda had moved to the center of the room, watching him. Not anxious. Not alarmed. Just there. Ethan didn't look at him right away. He leaned forward again, hands clasped, and head lowered slightly. Not here. The words came out under his breath. Flat. Controlled. He stayed like that for a while. The wind outside softened for a moment, then picked up again. The rhythm changed, and with it, the memory shifted. A voice. Low. Urgent. Contact left. Ethan's jaw tightened. His eyes closed for half a second, then opened again. The cabin snapped back into place. The chair, the table, the door, Coda. Everything exactly where it should be. But the feeling didn't leave. It sat there, underneath, like something waiting. Ethan leaned back in the chair, resting his head against the wall. The wood was cold against the back of his skull. He stared at the ceiling. The cracks in the boards formed lines he had traced 100 times before. Familiar, predictable, safe, but nothing like the place he had just come from. His eyes drifted toward the door, toward the direction of the rock, the basin, the water, the steady sound. He pushed himself up again. Not fast. Not reactive. Just moving. He crossed the room and opened the door. Cold air rushed in immediately. Coda stood and followed. Outside, the light had shifted again. Clouds lower now. The wind carrying a sharper edge. Ethan stepped out and stopped. Looked toward the rock. From here, it was just stone again. Nothing more. He walked halfway across the clearing, then stopped. Didn't go all the way. Didn't need to. He could feel it from here. Not physically. Not like the air in the crack. Something else. Presence. Not a sound. Not a movement. Just something that hadn't been there before. Coda moved ahead of him, stopping at the same spot as earlier, turning, waiting. Ethan watched him, then looked at the crack again. The memory of the basin pressed forward. The warmth. The quiet. The way the sound of water didn't break the silence. It filled it. He exhaled slowly. His shoulders loosened slightly. Not relaxed, but less tight. He didn't step forward. Didn't go back in. Not yet. He stood there instead, between the cabin and the rock, between the cold and the warmth, between what he knew and what he didn't. Coda sat down near the crack, settled, like he had chosen his place. Ethan stayed where he was, watching, listening, not to the wind, not to the trees, to the space between them, the kind of quiet that didn't press, didn't echo, didn't pull anything from him. For the first time in a long while, his breathing evened out on its own. No force, no control, just steady. He stood there longer than he meant to, long enough for the light to shift again, long enough for the cold to creep back into his hands. When he finally turned back toward the cabin, he didn't feel lighter, didn't feel fixed. Nothing had been solved. Nothing had been healed. But something had changed. Not in the world. In him. He stopped at the door, looked back one more time. Coda remained by the crack. Still. Focused. Listening. Ethan held that image for a second longer, then stepped inside. This time when he sat down, he didn't lean forward. He leaned back. And for a moment, just a moment, the silence didn't push against him. It held. Morning came slower the next day. Well, not because the sun waited, but because Ethan did. He lay on the cot without sleeping, eyes open, watching the ceiling as the gray light crept across the boards. The wind had died down overnight. What remained was a thinner quiet, stretched across the land like frost. For once, it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like space. Ethan swung his legs over the side of the cot and sat there for a moment, hands resting on his thighs, breathing steady. Then he stood. No hesitation. No pause at the door. Just movement. Coda was already up, waiting. Ethan grabbed the lantern, checked the fuel without thinking, then reached for the coil of rope he had left by the wall. He added a small pack, basic supplies. Knife, canteen, a strip of cloth. Habit, not plan. He stepped outside. Cold, sharp, but expected. Coda moved ahead. There's not sprinting this time. Not urgent. Just purposeful. He didn't stop halfway. Didn't check back. He knew where they were going. Ethan followed. When they reached the granite wall, the crack looked smaller than it had the day before. Or maybe Ethan saw it differently now. He didn't study it, didn't question it. He stepped in. The transition hit immediately. Cold to neutral, wind to still, noise to muted. The stone closed around him for the first stretch, pressing against his shoulders, brushing his back. He adjusted without thinking. Angle, weight shift, breath control. Coda moved ahead, slipping through the narrow passage with practiced ease. Ethan followed. Faster this time. Not reckless. Just familiar. The bend came. The space widened. And then the basin opened again. Exactly as it had been. Nothing shifted. But nothing collapsed. Nothing changed. The water still ran in that same thin ribbon along the wall. The light still filtered through the fractures above. The air still held that steady, impossible warmth. Ethan stepped into the center of it and stopped. Not in disbelief, in confirmation. It was real. Coda walked past him and made a slow circle along the edge, nose low, scanning the ground, the walls, the corners. His movement wasn't random. It followed a pattern, one Ethan recognized without naming. Clear the space. Ethan watched him for a moment, then set the lantern down. He stood still, letting the place settle around him. Then he moved, first to the seep. He crouched, placed his hand in the water again. Same temperature, same flow, no change. He shifted slightly, studying how it ran along the stone, not the path it followed, where it pooled. His eyes tracked the edge of the basin. Natural containment. Minimal loss. He stood and moved to the ledges along the wall, ran his hand across the surface. Solid, dry, raised above the floor just enough. Storage. His gaze lifted to the ceiling. Light sources, multiple fissures. Not direct, but consistent. He stepped back, looked at the entire space. Not as a discovery anymore, as a structure. His mind started building without permission. Water source, shelter, thermal stability, airflow. Everything aligned. Not perfect, but close. Ethan exhaled slowly, then moved. He walked back toward the passage entrance and grabbed the rope, dragged it inside, set it near the wall, then went back again. This time, he returned with a small bundle of wood he had left near the entrance earlier. Test load. He carried it into the basin, set it down. Nothing shifted. No collapse. No echo. Just the same quiet absorption of sound. He stood over the pile, then nudged one piece with his boot, watched how it settled. Stable. He crouched again, adjusting the pieces into a tighter stack, placing them on one of the natural ledges. Out of the damp. Out of the way. He stepped back, looked at it, then at the rest of the space. Coda sat nearby, watching him, not restless, not confused, just present. Ethan moved again, back to the water. This time he followed its path downward, tracing where it disappeared into a smaller crack in the floor. Drain. Natural. Continuous. He crouched, touched the stone near the edge. Damp, but not saturated, manageable. He stood, turned, walked the perimeter again, slower, more deliberate. He stopped near a curved section of wall. The air felt slightly warmer here, subtle, but there. He placed his hand against the rock, held it there, then nodded once. Sleeping position, not spoken, just understood. Coda shifted slightly, moving closer to that same spot. Ethan glanced at him. You feel it too. Coda didn't react. Didn't need to. Ethan stepped back again, scanning the entire basin. This time not as a stranger, as someone mapping ownership. Not of land, of function, of purpose. He moved back toward the entrance and paused. Looked at the narrow passage behind him, then back at the basin, then at Coda. A thought formed. Simple. Clear. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. He turned and walked out again. The cold hit him harder this time. Not because it had changed, because it didn't belong anymore. Ethan moved quickly across the clearing, back to the cabin. He didn't stop. Didn't scan the ridge, didn't pause at the door. He went inside, grabbed what he needed. A second coil of rope, a small axe, a canvas sack. Then he turned and headed back. Coda followed. No hesitation. The pattern repeated. In, out, in again. Each trip deliberate. Each movement building something. Not a structure yet. Not a plan fully formed. But direction. By midday, the basin had changed. Not visibly, but functionally. Wood stacked. Tools placed. Paths understood. Ethan stood in the center, breathing steady. Not rushed. Not scattered. Focused. The space held him differently now. Not as a place to observe, as a place to use. Coda moved to the entrance again, pausing there. His ears shifted slightly, head lifting, listening. Ethan noticed, followed his gaze. The passage remained still, but something in Coda's posture changed. Subtle. But there. Ethan stepped toward him. Not fast, not slow, controlled. He stopped a few feet away, watched. Coda let out a low sound. Not the same as before. Not curious. Alert. Ethan's shoulders tightened just slightly, his head tilted. Listening. The basin stayed quiet. The water continued its steady flow. The light held. Nothing moved. But the feeling shifted. Not in the space. In the moment. Ethan glanced toward the entrance again, then back at Coda. "What is it?" Coda didn't answer. He just stood there, focused on the passage, waiting. Yet Ethan didn't move right away. He let the moment stretch. Coda's body had shifted just enough, weight forward, ears angled, breath slowed. Not alarm, not panic. Awareness. Ethan stepped closer to the passage, stopping just behind the dog. His hand didn't go to his knife this time. It hovered near it, ready. He tilted his head slightly, listened. The basin held steady, water trickled, light filtered, no movement. But something, somewhere beyond the bend, had changed. Or maybe it wasn't inside. Ethan turned his head slightly toward the entrance behind them, the narrow crack leading out. His eyes narrowed. He stepped past Coda, moved toward the exit. Slow, measured. Coda followed, close at his side now. Not ahead. Not this time. They reached the tight passage and Ethan slipped through, his shoulders brushing the stone again, the warmth fading as he moved forward. The air cooled. The silence shifted. By the time he stepped out into the open, the wind had returned, stronger now, carrying sound with it. Ethan paused just outside the crack, listened. Then he saw it. Tracks. Not his, not Coda's. Boot prints. Fresh. Cutting across the frost toward the clearing. Ethan's body went still. His eyes followed the line of prints without moving his head. Measured. Direction. Approach from the south ridge. Not random. Not wandering. Deliberate. Coda stepped forward, nose low, confirming. Ethan crouched beside the tracks, gloved hand hovering just above them. Edges still sharp. No melt. Recent. Very recent. He stood slowly, turned, scanned the ridge, left, right, tree line, movement. Oh, there. A shape near the edge of the clearing. Two figures. One closer, one behind. Ethan's posture shifted. Not aggressive, not retreating. Balanced. The closer man stepped forward first. Mid-50s, heavy jacket, hands visible. But his eyes weren't looking at Ethan. They were scanning the land, measuring. Dale Turner. Ethan recognized him before the man spoke. "Didn't expect to see you out here this early," Dale called out, voice carrying through the wind. Ethan didn't respond right away. His gaze shifted to the second man. Younger, late 40s maybe. Clean boots, too clean for this terrain. Posture straight, head turning slightly, taking in angles, distances, elevation. Not a local. The man stepped forward, stopping a few paces behind Dale. His eyes landed on Ethan, then shifted to the rock. The crack. Held there a second longer than necessary, then back to Ethan. That your place? The man asked, voice calm, even. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Coda stepped slightly in front of him. Not aggressive. Just there. The man noticed. His gaze flicked down to the dog, then back up. Still calm, still calculating. Dale cleared his throat. This is Victor Hayes, he said. He's been looking at land around here. Ethan's eyes stayed on Victor. Didn't shift, didn't soften. Victor nodded once. Not much out here, he said, glancing around again. Mostly rock, wind. His eyes returned to the crack. Held there. Just a fraction too long. Ethan caught it. Didn't react. Victor took a few slow steps forward. Not toward Ethan. Toward the rock. Coda's stance tightened. Low. All controlled. Ethan's hand dropped slightly closer to his side. Victor stopped a few feet from the crack. Looked at it. Really looked this time. Not casually. Not like someone passing through. He crouched slightly. Ran his hand along the edge of the stone. Didn't touch the opening, but close enough. His head tilted just a fraction. Then he stood again. Interesting formation, he said. Flat, neutral. But his eyes had changed. Ethan stepped forward, just enough to close the distance between them. That's as close as you get. The words came out steady. No edge. No warning. Just fact. Victor looked at him, held the gaze, then nodded once. Fair enough? He stepped back, hands still visible, but his attention hadn't left the rock. Dale shifted his weight. Victor here's been thinking about picking up some of this land, he said. Thought I'd show him around. Ethan's eyes flicked to Dale for half a second, then back to Victor. Nothing to pick up, Ethan said. Just rock. Victor smiled slightly. Not friendly, not unfriendly, just measured. Sometimes that's where the value is. Ethan didn't respond. The wind picked up again, pushing through the clearing, carrying loose dirt across the ground. Victor turned slowly, scanning the rest of the area. Tree line, slope, cabin in the distance, then back to the rock, always back to the rock. Ethan saw it. Didn't need to ask. Victor took a step back toward Dale. We'll be in touch, he said, almost casually. Ethan didn't answer. Victor nodded once more, then turned and started back toward the ridge. Most Dale hesitated a second longer. Looked at Ethan, then at the crack, then back again. You ought to be careful out here, he said. Ground's not always what it looks like. Ethan held his gaze. Neither are people. Dale didn't smile, didn't argue. He turned and followed Victor. Their figures moved up the slope, shrinking against the gray sky until they disappeared into the trees. Ethan didn't move, not right away. He stood there, watching the ridge long after they were gone. Coda remained at his side, still, focused. Ethan finally exhaled, slow, measured. His eyes shifted back to the crack. The rock looked the same, unchanged, but something had shifted. Not in the stone, in the situation. He stepped closer, placed his hand near the opening. The faint warmth was still there, unmoved, untouched. But now, it wasn't just his secret. Ethan pulled his hand back. His jaw tightened slightly. Coda let out a low, quiet sound. Not fear, not warning, recognition. Ethan glanced down at him. Yeah, he muttered. He turned toward the cabin, then stopped. Looked back one more time at the rock, at the narrow line cutting into it, at the place that shouldn't exist. Then he walked away. But this time, he didn't leave it behind. And somewhere beyond the ridge, eyes that had already measured it were thinking about coming back. The letter arrived 2 days later. It didn't come with warning. No truck grinding up the dirt path. No voice calling from the road. Just a white envelope tucked under the cabin door, edges curled slightly from the cold. Ethan noticed it the moment he stepped inside. He hadn't expected anything. Well, not out here. He closed the door behind him, crouched, and picked it up. No return address. Official seal in the corner. County. He didn't open it right away. Coda stood near the table watching him, head slightly lowered, reading something in Ethan's posture before Ethan even moved. Ethan turned the envelope over once in his hands, then tore it open. The paper inside was thick, printed, formal. He read it once, then again, slower. The words didn't change. Notice of mineral interest filing. Disputed boundary. Preliminary survey rights granted. His jaw tightened. Not a reaction, a recognition. He folded the paper once, then set it on the table. Didn't slam it. Didn't crumple it. Just placed it down. Coda stepped closer. Ethan didn't look at him. Not yet. He moved to the window instead and looked out toward the ridge. Nothing there. Same trees, same wind, same silence. But the land didn't feel the same anymore. It felt watched, measured. He turned back to the table, picked up the paper again, read the last line. Filed by Victor Hayes. Of course. Ethan exhaled slowly. His fingers tapped once against the edge of the paper, then stopped. He reached for his jacket. Didn't think. Just moved. Coda was already at the door. They stepped outside together. The cold hit sharp, clear. Ground frozen solid now. Tracks from earlier days still visible in places. Ethan moved fast, not running, but direct. Down the narrow path toward the main dirt road that cut through the lower ridge. The county office sat 12 miles out. A single building. One desk. One person who decided what land meant. Ethan drove in silence. The truck rattled over uneven ground, engine steady but worn. Coda sat beside him, still, eyes forward, tracking movement out the windshield. Neither of them spoke. By the time they reached the town, if it could be called that, the sky had shifted to a dull afternoon gray. The office door creaked when Ethan pushed it open. Inside, it smelled like paper and dust. Laura Finch looked up from behind the desk. Mid-30s, sharp eyes, no wasted movement. You're early, she said, glancing at the clock. Ethan didn't respond to that. He stepped forward and placed the letter on her desk. She read it. Once, then again. Her expression didn't change much, but something behind her eyes shifted. When did this come in? She asked. This morning. She nodded slowly. Figures. Ethan leaned one hand on the edge of the desk. Tell me what it means. Laura leaned back slightly, folding her arms. It means someone filed a mineral interest claim on land they believe isn't fully protected under your current title. Ethan's eyes didn't move. Is it? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for a folder, pulled it open, and scanned a map. Your claim covers the cabin, the surrounding acreage, but the eastern rock face, she tapped the map, sits right on the edge of your boundary. Ethan's jaw tightened again. Meaning? Meaning if there's any question about what's inside that rock. She paused, choosing her words. They can argue it's not technically yours. Ethan didn't blink. They haven't even been inside. Laura looked up at him. Up. Oh, they don't have to. Silence settled between them. Coda shifted slightly beside Ethan's leg. Laura tapped the paper once. This gives them the right to request a survey, and while that's pending, they can stop me. Laura nodded. From making changes, from claiming improvements, from using anything inside as evidence of ownership. Ethan stared at the map, at the line, a line that didn't exist on the ground, but mattered here. So what's the play? Laura leaned forward slightly. 2 options. Ethan didn't move. She continued. You challenge the claim. Prove the formation sits inside your boundary. And if it doesn't? She didn't answer immediately. Then, they take it. The word sat there. Flat. Final. Ethan exhaled once. Slow. His hand lifted slightly off the desk, then settled again. Timeline. Survey's already been requested. If it moves fast, A few weeks. Ethan nodded once, then turned. No more questions. No hesitation. He walked out. Coda followed. The cold outside felt sharper now. Not cleaner, just sharper. Ethan climbed into the truck and sat there for a second before starting the engine. His eyes moved across the horizon, measuring, calculating. The drive back felt shorter. Or maybe his mind just filled the space. By the time he reached the cabin, the light had started to fade again. Ethan stepped out. Didn't go inside. He stood there, looking toward the rock, the crack, the place that had felt like a secret 2 days ago. Now, it felt like something under threat. Coda moved ahead a few steps, then stopped, turned, waiting. Ethan followed, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving. When they reached the crack, Ethan didn't go in. He stood outside it, hand hovering near the stone, the faint warmth still there, unchanged, untouched. He closed his eyes for a second, then opened them. His voice came out low. Not losing this. Coda stood beside him, still, solid. Ethan looked down at him, then back at the rock, the line in the stone that shouldn't have mattered, but now did. More than anything else. He stepped back, turned toward the cabin. But his eyes didn't leave the rock, not even when the light faded, not even when the cold set in. Because somewhere beyond the ridge, someone had already decided it didn't belong to him. The next morning, Ethan didn't bring the lantern. He didn't bring the rope either. Just the knife and Coda. The sky was low, heavy with clouds that hadn't decided whether to snow or hold. The air felt thicker, quieter, like the land was waiting for something to happen. Ethan moved straight to the rock. No pause, no hesitation. Coda was already there, but something had changed. He wasn't focused on the original crack. Not this time. He stood a few feet to the right, nose low, moving in short, deliberate arcs along the base of the wall. Searching. Ethan slowed, watched. Coda stopped, pressed his nose against a section of stone that looked no different than the rest. Then he pawed at it once, stopped, listened, then pawed again. Same spot. Ethan stepped closer. What is it? Coda didn't answer. He leaned in harder, pushing his shoulder against the rock as if trying to feel something through it. Ethan crouched, ran his hand along the surface. Cold, solid, but there. Faint. A line, not as obvious as the first crack, but present. A seam, lower, wider at the base. Ethan pressed his palm against it. Waited. Nothing. Then, a shift. Not air this time. Not warmth. Something deeper. He leaned in, bringing his ear close to the stone. The sound came through, faint. Too faint to name. But it was there. Coda let out a low, tight sound. Not the same as before. More urgent. Ethan stood, stepped back, looked at the original crack, then back at this one. 2 points. Same wall. Different angles. His mind started mapping. Passage direction. Internal structure. Space beyond. Not just one, he muttered. Coda stepped back suddenly. Ears up, body tense. Ethan's head snapped toward him. What? The ground shifted. Not a collapse, not a break. Not a subtle slide. A section of loose stone near the base gave way under Ethan's boot. His weight shifted forward. Balance gone. His foot slipped into the gap that had opened beneath the loose rock. The drop wasn't deep, but it was sudden, enough to throw him off. Ethan's body reacted before thought. Hands out, trying to catch himself. But the angle was wrong. The ground under him shifted again. And then, force. A solid impact from the side. Coda. The dog slammed into him, shoulder first, knocking Ethan sideways out of the collapsing section. They both hit the ground hard, stone scraping against jacket. Air knocked from lungs. Ethan rolled once, instinct pulling him away from the unstable ground. The loose rock shifted again behind them, then settled, still. Silence returned, but different now, and he lay there for a second, breathing hard, eyes open, focused. Then he pushed himself up, fast, turning back toward the spot. The ground had partially collapsed inward, revealing a deeper seam beneath the surface. Not a full opening, but enough. Enough to see darkness beyond. Ethan stared at it, then looked at Coda. The dog was standing. But something was wrong. His stance, weight uneven. Ethan moved immediately. Coda! He crouched beside him, hands already moving, checking. Front leg, left side. There, a shallow cut along the lower leg. Not deep, but bleeding. Stone had caught him when they fell. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the cloth, and wrapped it around the wound. Firm, controlled, not too tight. Coda didn't pull away, didn't whine, and just stood there, steady, eyes locked on Ethan. "You're all right," Ethan muttered, more to himself than the dog. He secured the wrap, checked it once more, then sat back slightly. His breathing slowed, not from calm, from control. He glanced back at the collapsed section, then at the original crack, then back at Coda. The dog shifted slightly, testing his weight. Then he turned, not away, toward the new opening. Ethan watched him. "Coda." The dog stepped forward. Careful now, slower, but certain. He lowered his head toward the newly exposed gap, listening. Again. Ethan followed, crouched beside him. The air from this opening was different. Not warm, not like the basin. Cooler, but moving, connected. His fingers traced the edge of the break. The stone here was thinner, weaker. As the collapse hadn't created something new, it had revealed something that had always been there. A deeper layer, a second path. Ethan leaned closer, peered into the darkness. The angle was wrong to see far, but he didn't need to. He could feel it. This wasn't separate. It connected. Somewhere. Inside. Coda let out a low sound again. Not pain. Not warning. Recognition. Ethan exhaled slowly. His hand rested briefly on the dog's neck. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You knew." Coda didn't move, didn't look away. Ethan sat there for a moment longer, letting the pieces fall into place. The basin, the warmth, the water. And now, this. Another access point. Another layer. Another part of something bigger than he had first understood. He stood. Slowly. Carefully. His eyes moved across the rock face again, seeing it differently now. Not as surface, as structure, as depth. He looked down at Coda. The bandage held. The bleeding had slowed. The dog stood steady, still ready. Ethan nodded once. "Not done yet." The words came out low, firm. Not a question, not a plan, a decision. He stepped back from the wall, looked at both openings, the one he had entered and the one that had revealed itself. Then he turned toward the cabin. Coda followed, closer than before, limp slight, but present. Ethan didn't look back this time, not because it didn't matter, because now he knew it did. And whatever was inside that rock, it wasn't just shelter, it was proof. And if the line on a map couldn't hold it, something else would have to. Because Coda had found it, and Coda didn't get things wrong. Oh, the map on Laura Finch's desk didn't look like much. Lines, numbers, angles, nothing that showed wind, nothing that showed rock, nothing that showed the way a place felt when you stood in it. Ethan stared at it anyway, not guessing, not hoping, measuring. Laura leaned over the desk, one hand braced against the paper, the other holding a pencil she hadn't used yet. "Walk me through it again," she said. Ethan didn't look up. "There's the main crack," he said, tapping a point near the eastern edge of the boundary line. "That's where the passage starts." Laura nodded. "And the basin?" "Roughly 40 to 50 feet in. Opens up here." He moved his finger inward, across the drawn line. Laura followed. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "And the second opening?" Ethan paused, then shifted his finger slightly lower along the same edge. "Here," Laura frowned. "That's outside the original boundary line. Not the inside of it." She looked up at him. "What do you mean?" Ethan straightened slightly. "The surface line's wrong." Laura didn't speak, just watched him. Ethan reached for the pencil, didn't ask, just took it. He drew a small mark near the corner of the boundary. "Marker's here. I said it myself." Laura leaned in. "That's what's on record." Ethan nodded. Then he drew a second line. Not flat, not straight, angled. "This ridge isn't a flat wall. It folds inward." Laura's eyes tracked the line. "If the formation folds, then what looks like outside on paper," Ethan finished, "is actually inside the boundary when you follow the structure." Silence settled between them. Laura looked back at the map, then at Ethan, then back again. "Do you have proof?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a small object, set it on the desk. Stone. Worn, but marked. A shallow engraving cut into the surface. Numbers, coordinates, old. Laura leaned closer. "Where did you get this?" "Inside." She picked it up carefully, turned it in her hand. "This isn't recent." Ethan shook his head. "Older than anything filed here." Laura's fingers traced the markings. Then she set it down. "If this was placed inside the formation, it proves the interior existed before any claim." Laura nodded slowly. "And if the interior sits within your boundary, there's no adjacent land to claim." The words stayed in the air. Simple. Clear. Laura exhaled once, then straightened. "Oh, we take this to the survey." Ethan nodded. "No delays." No delays. The survey happened 3 days later. Cold morning, clear sky, the kind of day where sound carried further than it should. Victor Hayes was already there when Ethan arrived, standing near the ridge, hands in his pockets, watching. Not the land. Ethan. Coda walked beside him, steady despite the bandaged leg. No hesitation, no limp visible unless you looked for it. Victor's eyes dropped briefly to the dog, then back up. "You found something," he said. Not a question. Ethan didn't answer. Didn't need to. Laura stepped forward instead. "Survey's here to confirm boundaries," she said evenly. Victor smiled slightly. "Of course." The surveyor arrived last. Older man, quiet, no interest in conversation. Just work, chains, markers, measurements. He didn't ask questions. Didn't care about tension. He moved from point to point, recording distances, checking angles, comparing the land to the map. Ethan stood back, watching, not interfering. Coda sat beside him, still. Victor paced once, then stopped, then paced again. Not nervous, impatient. The surveyor reached the granite formation, paused, looked at the original boundary marker, then at the rock, then back at his notes. He moved slowly along the edge, checking, measuring. Then he stopped, right at the corner. His head tilted slightly. He adjusted his position, measured again, then again. Laura watched closely. Victor stopped moving. Ethan didn't shift, didn't speak. The surveyor straightened, closed his notebook halfway, then looked at the rock. "This formation," he said, his voice low, steady, "falls within the boundary markers." Victor didn't react. Not outwardly, but his jaw tightened slightly. The surveyor continued. "The interior structure would be considered part of the same landmass." Laura nodded once. Ethan didn't move. Victor stepped forward. "That's not what the original filing suggests." The surveyor didn't look at him. "The land suggests otherwise." Silence followed. Heavy. Still. Victor exhaled slowly, then nodded once. "Understood." But his eyes didn't agree. Laura stepped forward. "So, the claim, invalid," the surveyor said simply. No emphasis, no hesitation, just fact. Victor looked at Ethan, held his gaze, longer this time. Then he nodded again. "Seems I misjudged the ground." Ethan didn't respond. Victor turned, walked back toward his truck, didn't look back. Laura let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "It's done," she said. Ethan nodded once. Coda stood, stepped forward. Closer. Ethan reached down, resting his hand briefly on the dog's neck. Not a gesture. A confirmation. The land didn't change. The rock didn't shift. The basin remained hidden beneath the surface. But something else, something that had never been visible, had just been made clear. It had always been his, now. The paper agreed. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces. A softer wind, longer light, the frost pulling back from the ground inch by inch. Ethan noticed it without thinking about it. The way he noticed most things now, quietly, without the sharp edge that used to come first. The cabin still stood where it always had, leaning slightly into the slope, boards worn, roof holding. Nothing about it had changed, but he didn't spend as much time inside anymore. Most mornings he stepped past it, toward the rock. Coda moved ahead of him, steady now, the bandage gone, the leg healed clean. No limp, no hesitation. The crack waited, unchanged, unremarkable, until you stepped inside. The transition still came the same way. Cold to neutral, wind to still, noise to quiet. Ethan moved through the narrow passage without slowing now, shoulders turning just enough, feet finding the uneven ground without testing every step. Familiar. By the time he reached the basin, the light had already found its way through the fractured ceiling. Not strong, but enough. Enough to see what had grown. The patch along the seep wall had spread. What had once been bare stone now held green. Low plants, small leaves, nothing dramatic, but alive. Ethan crouched near the edge of the water, watching the way it flowed, unchanged, steady as ever. He reached out, letting his fingers trail through it. Same temperature, same movement. Constant. Behind him, Coda moved along the perimeter, checking the edges, pausing near the entrance, then circling back. Always the same pattern, always first. Ethan stood and walked toward the ledges. The wood he had stacked weeks ago remained dry. The tools sat where he had placed them. The sleeping space near the warmer section of stone had taken shape, not built in the way a house was built, but arranged, used. There was a rhythm to it now, a system. Not forced, not planned on paper, just understood. He moved to the center of the basin and stopped, listened. The water, the faint shift of air through the cracks above, Coda's quiet movement against stone. Nothing else. No echoes, no pressure, no sudden pull of memory. The silence here didn't press against him. It held. He exhaled slowly. His shoulders dropped, not as a reaction, not as a release, just settled. Coda returned to him, sitting nearby, eyes steady. Ethan reached down, resting his hand briefly on the dog's neck. Not a gesture of reassurance. A habit. A connection. They stood there for a while. No need to move. No need to speak. The light shifted slightly as the sun moved above, the narrow beams splitting into softer angles across the stone. Ethan watched it, tracked it, not because he had to, because he could. Time moved differently here. Oh, not slower. Just clearer. He turned toward the small ledge near the sleeping area, reached down, picked up a stone. White, smooth, worn by water. He turned it once in his hand, then walked back to where Coda had settled, lowered himself to the ground. Not stiff, not guarded. Just down. He placed the stone beside the spot where Coda lay, not lined up, not arranged with precision, just placed. Coda glanced at it once, then back at Ethan. Ethan didn't look at the stone again. His eyes moved to the ceiling, to the fractures in the rock where light filtered through, to the slow drift of something that didn't need to be named. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge. Inside, it didn't reach. Ethan leaned back slightly, resting his weight against the stone behind him. His breathing stayed even, no sharp edges, no sudden shifts. Just steady. The kind of steady that didn't come from control. It came from absence, from space, from something not pulling at him anymore. Coda shifted slightly, settling closer. Ethan's hand rested against the dog's side, not gripping, not holding. Just there. The water continued its quiet path along the wall. The light shifted again, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't track every sound, didn't scan every shadow, didn't measure every second. He just sat, in a place that had been hidden, in a space that had been found. Not by him, by the dog beside him. And as the light moved across the stone and settled into the basin, Ethan closed his eyes. Not from exhaustion, not from habit, just because he could. And this time, nothing pulled him back. Also, if you made it all the way here, I want to ask you something simple. Drop a 1 in the comments if you believe Coda knew from the very beginning. Or drop a 0 if you think Ethan was the one who needed to find it himself. No long comment. No explanation. Just one number. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, if it felt real in any way, make sure you subscribe. Because the next story might hit even closer to home, and you won't want to miss it.